In this video, we're going way back to the beginning of the font family tree, to the origins of typography. And then we'll come all the way back to the fonts of today. You'll learn a lot about the history of different kinds of typeface and also how to use them. So where did typography start? I'm going to give you a broad overview with a few examples. And just a warning, I'm not an expert, and some of these topics are matters of national pride. So this overview is just to give you some general background. First, what are we talking about? The word typography in English comes from the Greek roots typos, meaning impression, and graphia, meaning writing. So we're covering all the forms of writing that are made by impressions rather than handwriting. Early examples of typography are seals and discs. These date back to the 19th and 18th century BC. They were usually made of hard stones and pressed into clay and were used as a way to mark ownership or identification. For anything else, handwriting was an easier method. It doesn't make sense to carve an entire stone anytime you want to write something new. The next real innovation didn't take place until a few thousand years later, with movable type. As its name suggests, movable type is type that can be moved around and rearranged to make different combinations, usually of letters, words, numbers, etc. There was a lot of innovation in China starting around 1000 AD, with ceramic movable type and wood movable type being developed. Then in 1377 in Korea, metal movable type was used to print the Jikji, which remains the oldest existing book printed with metallic movable type. Then, in 1455, the first book with Western letters was printed with movable type. That's right, Johannes Gutenberg's Bible. And that was the beginning of what we think of as typography in the Western world. We'll now explore the different categories of fonts and how and when they came about. The differences between can be subtle, and that's because, as Wikipedia says, although typography has evolved significantly from its origins, it is a largely conservative art that tends to cleave closely to tradition. And tradition is why we have the first fonts that were used by early printers. Blackletter fonts, otherwise known as Fraktur or Gothic. These fonts simply mimic the type of writing that already existed in books, which were made by monks handwriting page after page. These fonts are still available, but they're literally the ye olde typeface option. They can be used for headlines, as the Frankfurter Allgemeine does, but beyond that, it's typically seen as a stylistic choice that symbolizes a very old style which is onerous to read these days. Printers quickly realized that they didn't need to imitate monk handwriting if they were using movable type, and Roman type was developed around the 1470s. This typeface was based on type that was found carved into the buildings of the Roman Empire. This typeface looks much more familiar, and the popular Times New Roman font is a descendant. Original Roman fonts can look antique if used today, but they're still legible and functional. Italics came next, around the same time. This typeface was originally intended to be used for popular books, often poetry, that weren't as serious as other publications. Now, as you probably know, italics is used for emphasis, titles, foreign words, etc. The next innovation in font didn't happen until the 1700s, with William Castle's Old Style. You might be thinking, what's the difference between this and Roman? As I said, typography cleaves closely to tradition, but there are some differences. Look at the difference between thin and thick parts of the Old Style letters, whereas Roman font is fairly uniform in weight. Some examples of Old Style fonts are Baskerville, Garamond, Palatino, and Times New Roman. That's right, despite its name, Times New Roman is actually an Old Style font. And as you can probably tell, these fonts have a refined, classic, sometimes authoritative look. They can be used in almost any situation, and they have a bit of a personality sometimes, but for the most part, they're very neutral. The next group of typefaces were developed shortly after Old Style, in the 1700s and 1800s. The so-called modern typefaces also have a variation between thick and thin, but the serifs are flat compared to the slanted Old Style serifs. By the way, serifs are these little feet and hands on letters. Modern fonts are seen as refined, serious, and fashionable. Vanity Fair used a modern font for a long time, and Vogue uses Dido, also on a modern font. Another example of modern font is Bodoni, which is used for Mamma Mia. Even though they're very common today, sans serifs, or fonts without serifs, didn't come about until very late, 1816. And they weren't immediately popular. They're usually used for headlines and advertisements. Now, it's the main type of font used online. It's the most versatile category of typeface and also the safest bet. It can be used for paragraphs, headlines, you name it. Sans serifs can be very neutral, but they also give a serious or modern feel depending on the specific style. There are a lot of different kinds of sans serifs, but some main examples are Helvetica, Arial, and Open Sans. Finally, decorative fonts were developed in the 19th century. This was the Industrial Revolution, so there was an explosion of advertising and innovation, which meant that tons of different typefaces were developed. Decorative is a catch-all term for anything that's not in the other categories. And again, because typography cleaves closely to tradition, if a font isn't one of those first main categories, it's going to stand out. It's generally advised to stay away from decorative fonts in more serious fields like academia. But if you do use one, use it for headlines and titles only, never for body text. It's just too difficult to read for very long. Now let's do a quick test. Take a look at this famous wanted poster. How many typefaces are used? What categories do they fall into? I counted 6. Number 3 is definitely a sans serif, number 6 looks like an old style, and the others look like a mix of slab serifs, which are thicker serif fonts, and some other serif types. So that's a very quick history and overview of the main categories of typeface and how they came about. Now the next time you pick a font, you'll know what family it belongs to.